Hey everybody, it's Bust with our patch notes review for the 4.8 patch in Legends of Runeterra. This is the variety patch coming out of the heart of the Huntress, and it has some major updates to Vladimir with his head chopped off, right? This is not me just scrolling poorly on the page. You just get a nice shot of Vladimir crotch right up here in your preview of the patch. And so lots of changes. It feels like the number of new cards is smaller than usual. There's usually like 10. I guess we only have one variety patch to compare it to, but I think there's only like 6 or 7 new cards. But there is a massive number of changes across the existing standard and eternal cards, and so I think this will be a pretty interesting patch coming into this upcoming eternal season. See how much Vladimir will be looking to play. We'll talk about him a little bit more as he turns up. And so to come into the new cards, the first one, Divine Draft, P and Z card, slow spell, deals 1 damage to 2 separate things. And, you know, with this, these cards, when they're slow, they have to have a just absolute ton of upside. Since you can't play them in combat, you're really limited in the options with these things. And I think this will be only used in decks that have a lot of what we call and factor, right? So if, say, you're playing with Reforges and Augment, right? So you get the Reforge cards from Riven. They all play well on their own towards leveling up the Riven, but the and factor would be that they also help support the Augment cards like Vladimir. And so just oftentimes Reforge on its own isn't enough, but if you tie it in with Augment or a discard strategy or whatever, then it does become enough. And I think that's the space Divine Draft is in. It's not going to see any play on its own. You're not going to see this come in and start replacing Mystic Shots or anything, but as you play a deck like Seraphine, it's going to include 1 copy, or decks that are looking to have 2 cost spells matter, whatever. You have to be getting some kind of an additional advantage for this thing to work. And so I don't think that this is currently going to see too much play outside of potentially a 1-of from the Seraphine decks. Up next, we have the Crystalline Storm Raptor. These cards are always interesting in the sense when they merge 2 cards together, and I guess in this case that would be a Legion Rearguard Bird attached to an Avalanche, and I think this is probably not going to make the cut either. You know, it's tough to evaluate with this actually being attached to a card, especially in the sense when you're like, oh cool, what if we just play this with concurrent timelines, right? But like on its own, it's hard for me to imagine the kind of deck that really wants this. Like Avalanche sees very limited play, Blighted Ravine sees very limited play, things like Cryoclasm and Trundlequake see absolutely no play, and so if you're looking to get usage out of this, it's probably not for the AoE. And then if we're not using this for the AoE, why are we playing this 5 mana 3/2 unit? To me, the only real answer to that is going to be something like concurrent timelines. But, you know, Freylord is kind of starting to see things like the 3/4 unit that doesn't take damage from your own abilities, and then you have cards like Vladimir that want to see a bunch of non-combat damage dealt, and so you can come up with some scenarios where this would be useful. I just think it's probably way too expensive to actually be quite good. You can be, you know, drop Avalanche on the 3rd turn of the game. That's pretty spectacular. Not getting the kind of cheaty ramp out of spell mana for this guy makes me worry that he's just not going to be playable. Up next, though, Tidal Invocation. To me, this is far and away the most powerful and the most dangerous card coming out of this set. Deal 1 damage to a unit at fast speed and then spawn 1 for each damage dealt. And so on its own, without even that each damage dealt bit, this card would be incredibly powerful. Just being able to spawn at fast feed, kill a unit, and then like grow a tentacle in the middle of combat, like those types of shenanigans are ridiculously powerful. Like as it stood, you know, having Eye of Nagakaboros get nerfed from burst to focus was, you know, pretty gigantic. It wasn't enough to take it out of the realm of playability, but not being able to kind of combat trick with the Eye of Nagakaboros was a major boon for it for a while. And adding something in at fast speed just really adds back into that, especially if you're, you know, incidentally generating powder kegs. And so it's very interesting to see the likes of Eye of Nagakaboros just find its way into all kinds of decks. It had itself in Scouts for a while. Just any deck wanting to play cards and generate units are pretty happy to have it. Siren Song was in love with it here in recent days, but Tidal Invocation can kind of fit the same bill. It's not something that has to just be in a Tentacles-based deck. Having a removal spell that also generates a unit can be a pretty powerful ability, and I fully expect this to just be the highest impact card coming out of the Variety patch. Up next with the proliferating Dark Wraith. This one I had to read like 5 times to really kind of figure out what was going on. This is basically a go hard in a unit, right? And so you put the unit on the board, it dies, it shuffles into your deck, and then the future copies of it all grow. And so with this, like, at what point are you really going to be excited about this unit, right? If it's a 4/4 for 1, I guess that's a pretty good deal, but you're not doing that until like turn 5 or turn 6 of the game when you don't really care. If it gets up to 8/8 or 16/16, I guess that's kind of a thing, but it takes so much work to actually get there, and then when it does, it doesn't even have like Overwhelm or Fearsome or anything to actually have it deal combat damage. And so to me, this has to be in some kind of like weird combo deck with Atrocity. Some kind of way to be like, oh, cool, I've got this giant unit that I'm just going to throw at your face now. Because I don't think this style of game action to where you're just trying to draw multiple copies of this thing over and over again are really going to cut it. Especially in the sense that this doubles the stats of the Dark Wraiths in your deck. And so if you do have this spot to where you say you have 2/4/4 Dark Wraiths on the board, your attack, your opponent blocks one with a bigger unit, and then you glimpse beyond the other one to make the one you want grow. Those style of plays just don't exist with this thing since it's doubling the ones in your deck. And so I think that this will be, a fine Path of Champions card. Maybe you can make a nice meme deck out of this playing freeform, but in terms of standard or in terms of Eternal, I don't think that this is going to have any impact. Up next, the Crimson Banquet Hall. Very interesting card. One of the big things I always say that whenever it comes to evaluating cards out of a new set is you have to ask yourself, does this card let me break the rules of the game? And so does this card let me draw more cards? Does this make my cards cheaper? Does this copy a card? Like, does this bend or break the rules of the game as it is? And so having your allies cost 1 less most certainly breaks the rules of the game. It's just a matter of whether or not you can take advantage of that. And so I'm interested to see how the Banquet Hall goes in the sense of, are we using this as some kind of weird back alley bar as to where we have some kind of combo potential attached to this with the units all being cheaper? Are we using this to like flood the board with a bunch of units that make copies of themselves? Or are we going to be more so using this for the actual damage aspect of when you play an ally, deal 2 damage to it? And can we turn that into some kind of advantage? And so if you're playing like Scarmother Revna, if you're playing Swain, if you're playing Vladimir, just like all of these cards that want to see you deal damage to your own units, is that the way to actually take advantage of the Banquet Hall? And I lean more towards no, right? Those tend to be like really kind of magical Christmas landy style of decks as to where you're trying to get your Scar Grounds on the board and then you deal a bunch of damage to your own units and have all that nonsense go on. But I won't completely put it past something like that turning up. That's just not what I expect to see out of the competitive aspect of a card like Crimson Banquet Hall, as much as the allies cost 1 less being the real high power point coming out of this thing. Up next is Mr. Thrift. This is the one that strikes me as kind of being the toughest to evaluate. Like, at first glance, I just want to say that this card is garbage, right? It's a 0/3. It doesn't impact the board. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't even like double the boons and double the traps, right? It just says, when 1 or more of your traps activate, plant 2 of it into the deck. And then even as far as flashbang traps go, it doesn't plant them in like the top 8 cards. It just plants them somewhere random in the deck. And so I immediately read this and just go, ha, garbage. But it's like, it seems like this thing can just pop off super fast. And then if you're able to get it to have just like a single +1/+1 on it, then it becomes a real unit in its own. And so I have to kind of like slow down when it comes to Mr. Thrift. This is the one that I would kind of say has the potential to kind of creep up on us and actually be surprisingly good. But I'm really kind of polarized in my reaction in that, I think it's going to suck, but if you get 2 of these on the board and you play a bird and then you've started planting so many of these extra chimes and stuff, you can really kind of start to pop off with this guy. And so I think there may be something kind of interesting coming out with him. What's going to be the highest impact for us is we're just going to go immediately start playing scouts, and we're going to start generating this guy with Mirai Warden and just getting super pissed off. We generated another 0 power unit. And so we'll see. I'm leaning more towards not good than good, but if a card really surprised me out of this set, I think it would be Mr. Thrift. Up next, we have the Cosmic Call, so you can invoke an expensive Celestial for 2, or you can pay it for 8 and reduce the cost of all your Celestials by half. And this is a one, like, I think this card is just garbage as well. There might be a deck or two that's kind of interested in playing this, but I have a really hard time imagining the situations to where we want to be reducing the cost of those Celestials. They're just so good at winning the game on their own that, like, do I really want to play 8 mana to make the Scourge cost 5, or would I rather just play the Scourge and kill you? And so, you know, if there's ways to kind of generate this thing, maybe. It's just whenever it comes to the invoked decks, I don't feel like the problem is ever the mana aspect of it. I think it's just, you know, if you survive until turn 10, you just outright win the game. And when it comes to Cosmic Call, you're going to be like, okay, well, I'll play this on like turn 6 and make everything reduced by half, and then I'll play a big invoke and play a strong unit on turn 7. Maybe that's a thing. I don't know. It just strikes me as being terrible. And so I could definitely see, you know, like a little bit of potential of it in that sense. You know, whenever you have these buffs that do come down and let you cheat on mana and do hit things everywhere, then you might have something going for it. But that, you know, the initial investment of 8 mana to do nothing is just so huge that I don't know how easily you can overcome that. Or if you are able to overcome it, you might be having to high roll, right? So if you're trying to say, okay, I have 3 spell mana banked up, I'm going to play my Cosmic Call on turn 5. Now my Celestials are all at half cost. Then on turn 6, I play a Glimpse from Beyond, whatever the 2 mana Celestial Burst thing is. And you may not even hit a card that costs like 7 or 8, right? You're going to hit a Moon Silver, a Sneaky Snake Serpent Challenger thing, and then like a 3-cost card, and it's just going to feel completely terrible. And so I don't know. I'm not particularly sold on Cosmic Call whatsoever. Up next, we have Eris, a 2 mana elusive for 1. Or I'm sorry, a 2 mana elusive for 2 that has the Nexus Strike to summon a random husk. And I can tell you exactly what happened with Eris. Eris cost 1 mana, and then Riot printed Siren Song, and then Siren Song completely took over the meta for the entirety of a patch. And then they said, oh shit, we can't print Eris at 1 mana because Siren Song was just too ridiculous. Now we have to make her cost 2. I can guarantee you that was the entirety of the story that happened with Eris. I just can't imagine the space to where she was supposed to cost 2 initially. But like once I got past that kind of initial impression of LOL Siren Song, I had to stop and think of like, would we rather play Eris than a card like Salter, right? So the idea with Salter is you play him on turn 2, right? We're going to compare 2-cost cards. You get the Husk immediately, but then you're left with kind of a shitty unit, right? He doesn't do too much blocking and too much board relevance, but you get that Husk right away. And so if you say play Salter on turn 3 and get the Husk, you can play Evelyn on turn 4. You're guaranteed to get the Husk. With Eris, there's no guarantees attached to it, but you have the ability to get multiple Husks out of her, right? You can get 2 Husks, 3 Husks, and really kind of pop off in that sense. And to me, you just have to kind of like stop and ask yourself, are the extra Husks actually worth it, right? Like how excited, how amped are we if like everything goes according to plan and we get 2 Husks instead of just 1? And I don't think it's good enough, especially in comparison to the times where this fails in combat, right? Your opponent blocks it with Teemo, they use a removal spell on her, whatever, and then you just get 0 Husks. You have quite a bit of downside there to where Salter and Vora give you the guaranteed result. And so I think I'm probably kind of spot on with what happened with Eris. I mean, it doesn't strike me as being way too powerful to be summoning Husks on the first turn of the game, but I think Siren Song probably brought the death knell to Eris before she actually came on. I think the interesting question with this will be is if every Evelyn deck is playing 3 copies of Soltur and you're playing like 3 copies of Steam, but you only play between like 0 and 2 copies of Vora, is this the kind of card that could replace Vora? And there I'll give it a maybe, just in terms of the cost to get things happening, Vora being a little bit more expensive. Maybe that's the kind of space as to where Eris is the slightly worse Soltur, but better than Vora. But I don't think she's going to be a top tier Husk generator. So up next, we have Balin the Benevolent. This one is a very interesting one to me. As we've been mentioning the Siren Song, we got the recent reminder to how powerful these everywhere bonuses can be. And so the real question with Balin the Benevolent is, are there enough formidables to make this ability worth it? And is it strong enough on its own? And so as it comes to mind, the immediate exciting factor with Balin the Benevolent is, of course, Petricite Broadwing, which still see play all across the board. Getting it bonuses from Balin over and over again is incredibly good, especially in the sense that your future Broadwings are going to be better combatants as they get drawn later on in the game. But like, how all in do we want to go on this ability, right? In the past, I've played the 3-mana Petricite that doesn't take damage from spells. He's been fairly reasonable. You can include Galio up at the top end, but like, is that really enough to warrant playing Balin the Benevolent, or is that, kind of just reaching too far for these kind of abilities? And I think as it stands, with the cards that we currently have in the game, I'm leaning towards not that great with Balin. I just, like, as I start to include cards like Petricite Hound in my deck, I'm just like, this card's dog shit. I don't want to play these terrible cards, right? But I don't think Balin is quite enough to really push those over the edge. But I think also in kind of the same vein, there's kind of 2 things. Like, number one, if like one more good formidable gets printed, then Balin could be a thing. Or as kind of a stretch factor, if one more good card for Taric gets printed, then Balin the Benevolent could be a thing. So in the sense you're playing a deck like Poppy Taric, where you're playing the Petricite Broadwing, you're playing Balin the Benevolent, you're playing the 3-mana support guy that gives out Formidable, and then you're able to attack with Balin multiple times. Like, these are the kind of spaces to where I could see him being quite good. He really enjoys having a rally, he really enjoys having access to Cataclysm. Being able to attack with him a bunch of times opens up a lot of very interesting spaces. I'm just kind of questionable too, are there enough Formidables around right now to really make it worth it? And, I think in Eternal, we might have a shot to actually kind of try this out in the space that you get to play with cards like Troll Chant and you get to play with Dark Steel Spear. Dark Steel's the wrong game, but Darken Spear, Darken, whatever the Freylord equipment is that gives 0/2 and the bonuses in your deck. That's the kind of space to where the Formidables can really pop off, and you might have enough to go, or you just play Udyr, right? That's always the answer. Just play Udyr and get the 0/2 regenerate +2 health buff. And so, I mean, he's got some options. He's got some cards he can play with. I just lean towards he's not good enough right now, but as soon as we get one more medium quality formidable, he's gonna pop off. Last but not least, we have the Valley of Imitation, and this is a card I really struggle to evaluate cards like this. It's like you can immediately see it and just be like, oh cool, I'll copy this with Talia, and then I'm gonna be getting a bunch of units out of this thing and whatnot. But this is a card that strikes me as being some kind of combo card, and my brain just doesn't understand those decks, and it doesn't understand how to really make this thing pop off. And so if you want to be the one to come out here and do something with the Ambush Tycoon doubling stats, or using Curious Changelings, or using whatever to get these bonuses out of this transform thing, more power to you. Like, it should be a pretty easy way to just use this with the 2/4 that gives your transforms +1/+1 and impact. You should be able to just transform this unit over and over and over and over and over again. But Like I have a struggle with that style of deck. Playing these combos to double up your Nidalee and double up your Changeling, they just don't really function in my brain, and so I can't see the angles of attack with a card like Valley of Imitation. And so it strikes me as being quite powerful. There's a lot of kind of ebb and flow to this thing's power. If your opponent's open attacking you, this doesn't block, right? It's just stuck in landmark form. But being able to swap around between the different units every turn, essentially just being the best unit on the board every turn of the game while also retaining some of those bonuses from the transform, can make this quite a powerful dude. And so I think this could have some interesting potential. I'm still like really high on the power of having Avenging Vestayas and having Rite of Negations running around in Shurima, along with just whatever else you're trying to do. And so even morphing this guy into, I guess if he morphs into Avenging Vestaya, he won't be granted a buff that way, right? He won't just copy the spell shield off of the Vestaya, but he can pick up some buffs some other ways. And so I think there'll be something interesting with the Valley. My brain just doesn't work in the sense to pull it off. Okay, moving on into the standard adjustments. So everything forward, not going to be new cards, only going to be changes to existing cards. And so first and foremost, Champion Strength, one near and dear to our heart. They reduced its cost by 1, but it no longer does the scout thing. And so it used to, if you had the attack token, it would give all of your units scout. Doesn't do that anymore, only gives the +4/+4 in the rally. And so I think this is a very interesting buff in the sense that you just have to kind of pick and choose the kind of units that you want to use with this. As far as Champion Strength used to go, you could just play with whatever summons that you had coming out of Scouts. Your Mirai Wardens were exceptionally good because they would help you flood out the board, and then you didn't really care about the keywords that were on your units as much as just having 6 units on the board. The thing with this version of Champion Strength is you're going to have to care, right? You want your units to either have Elusive, Overwhelm, or have Scout being the kind of rally factor that will happen with this, and then the Champion Strength will still be just fine. And so I think decks like Scouts, they'll still be interested in Champion Strength, but they're going to maybe want to pay a little bit more attention to playing additional Scout units, right? So you definitely want the 3 copies of the 4-mana 2/4. You definitely have your 3 copies of Quinn, but you might look to include an additional Scout unit to additionally take advantage of the Champion Strength, so you get to attack twice with those Scout plays. Otherwise, the deck that kind of immediately came to mind to me was who am I? Back at Worlds, played a triple Champion Strength deck, and the one that really kind of stood out to me was the P and Z version, using Acorn and using Poro Cannons and Daring Poros. That style of thing still works just fine with Champion Strength, right? You can use Acorn to reduce its cost to 7, build up 3 spell mana pretty easily, and then if you're attacking your opponent for 15 elusive, the game should just be done. And so I think those style of decks will still be around and be fine. To me, where I think it will be interesting would be a deck like Alawi, right? Some kind of Alawi Vayne-style Demacia-based deck to where, you know, Alawi and the Tentacle probably have Overwhelm and they really benefit from this style of play. But you run into a lot of situations to where you're just like using a Vayne and using a Cataclysm and attacking with a singular unit over and over and over again. And that kind of cuts away from the strength you would get out of a card like Champion Strength. And so I don't think this is going away. I would most definitely call what happened here a nerf, but you just have to kind of like stop and think about the kind of units you're dropping into a Champion Strength these days. And it does give you, you know, a lot more distinction between playing a card like Champion Strength and playing a card like Golden Aegis. And so I think decks like Elites will be leaning towards cards like Golden Aegis. Decks like Scouts will be leaning towards cards like Champion Strength, since they do have those additional Scout units to attack. Up next, Sump Monument, catching a nerf. Thank Jesus. I hated this thing so much. I don't quite feel like this is nerfed into oblivion as much as I want it to be. I really want it to be planning like 10 shrooms and costing 9 mana. It's just my distinction on Sump Monument was this was a first of its kind across my 20 years of card gaming. This is the first card, to the best of my memory, that as soon as someone plays it, both players stop having fun, right? the idea for a card is for both players to have fun. Sometimes you have cards to where only one player is having fun. To the best of me, I can't remember any card across my history of card gaming to where it gets played and then neither player starts having fun. And so, props to the designer on Sump Monument for pulling off that fucking achievement, but I'm glad enough to see this thing get nerfed. I feel like the Teemo deck running through Standard, while fine and good, probably wasn't the best usage of Sump Monument. I think the best usage of Sump Monument was probably still Undiscovered, and I hope it just stays that way, because the deck that's able to really stall and take advantage of Sump Monument is going to be completely obnoxious. I imagine it's just some kind of combo deck that just needs to get to turn 10 and automatically wins. That to me is the place where Sump Monument belongs, and it can still do that in this form. It's just a little bit more challenging to pull off. Up next, Condense. I personally did not play too much of the Condense decks, the Gen Bandle City things with the Broadmains and the Riptide Rexes. Certainly played against it. Didn't play too much of it. I would suspect that anytime you're increasing the cost of a card, it certainly becomes worse, but this shouldn't be enough to really nerf these into oblivion. The big thing to me with the change of Condense going up to 3 would be those turns to where you want to copy Karina on turn 7. So, right, you would play Karina on turn 7, you would activate the Puff Caps, you would condense her for 2 mana, then you can play the 1 mana copy again and then pop off from there. Same idea with Riptide Rex in the sense that you could play Riptide Rex on turn 8, spend the 3 banked mana, copy them, and Riptide Rex again. Those are taken away from you. So any combo with Condense is going to be delayed a turn, but I think the decks that can really take advantage of this with Lord Broadmains are still going to be, reasonably happy to have this going, but it's most certainly going to be worse for any of the Condense-based combo decks, as I would call them, like the Karina-based Puff Caps decks. Up next is Swain, and so before we talk about Swain, I do want to stop and talk about Vladimir, and so we'll scroll to the end. We'll come back to Vladimir. I just want to point out that Vladimir is now capable of dealing much more damage, and so to give you a quick note on Vlad, he used to do that thing to where he deals damage to the units to the left and right of him, or he drains the units to the right, whatever. Now he has this ability to where he deals 1 damage to any number of allies, and then deals that much to an enemy. So you can deal 3 damage to your allies, and then deal 3 damage to an opposing unit. And so that would be 6 damage of non-combat damage that you can use. As we swing our way back up to Swain, as he says, he's increased his non-combat damage up to 16. And so the reason I wanted to say that, we'll talk about Vladimir a little bit more later, but it's going to take a little bit more work. I don't know how viable Swain will remain in Standard. I would say, he's not seeing a ton of play now, but that's, likely to change, especially as more tentacle cards get printed. But the big thing you could do with Swain was you would play the 1 mana tentacle can't attack thing, deal 6 damage to itself, and then if you get to play another one that's 12 damage, you have your Swain leveled up as soon as he comes down. And so they're looking for these little obnoxious things to be a little bit more challenging to pull off. So you can still get 6 ticks up with the Tentacle Statue. You can get 6 ticks up with the Nox and Fervor. If we're looking in the space of Eternal, as we're about to play through over the next month, you can use the Crusty Codger to deal 3 to itself in the 1 mana space. There's also the 2 mana guy that becomes a 3/4 challenger, right? There's a few different ways to deal a bunch of self damage, but it's going to be a little bit more challenging for Swain. I think he's still going to be exceptionally strong in the sense that going Swain on turn 6, your opponent invests 2 or 3 cards into him, into the Leviathan, into Swain, is still just an exceptionally powerful collection of cards. The Leviathan is so good on its own, and having him draw into just another gigantic, big, overwhelming bro is a very easy late game package that doesn't take a lot of work. And so I think Swain is still going to be spectacular in that sense. You're just not going to get as many of these turbo level games to where he's hitting flipped on turn 5, turn 6, which I think he's still going to be strong. But I did want to call out the likes of Vladimir, as Vladimir is now a way to really kind of enhance this flippability of Swain, in the sense if you deal 3 to your units, 3 to an opposing unit. That's 6 ticks up for Swain to really kind of help him pop off. But probably rather just play Twisted Fate, right? Up next, Purifying Flames gives 2 units +2/+2. I have played a fair amount of elusives over the course of the past 3 or 4 days. I don't know if this was entirely necessary, but it's probably healthy. I think I would still look to play it in elusives, but the deck is most certainly got to be weaker. The space that really interested me with me in elusives, I didn't realize the number of games that were going to come down to like 1 or 2 health. And with that in mind, Purifying Flames is definitely taking a nerf. And so we'll have to give the elusives a shot. I really liked the idea that's been circulating around here recently of using Yumi in the kind of space to where we use Forges and Weapon Masters over in Freylord. Using the attach units with cards like Purifying Flames. Having that weaken up right before the patch comes out bums me out a little bit, but it was probably a bit of a necessity. Up next, we have Pirouette. I think that this is a Pirouette change, should have been made a while ago. I think, I forget who it was I saw on Twitter suggesting this change, but I think they really hit the nail on the head, if you will. And that having Pirouette have a base cost of 3, but a 1 cost after a Plunder is much more fair than the 2 mana version reducing to 1. It really gives you the bonus for playing this thing within a Plunder deck and having all of the Plunder activators. And you can't just fit it in every Yasuo deck. You can't fit it in every Lord Broadmane deck. You know, you really have to kind of pick and choose where you want the Pirouette to fit, and if you're going to have the ability to activate it or not. I think this is a fantastic way to really kind of define this as a Plunder card that's still probably good enough to see a bit of constructed play, given that it's so versatile and so strong. Up next, Fish Fight. Up to 3 mana from 2. This is a pretty big nerf to Fish Fight. This is the space, I will say, to where so many of the curves involving Freylord and the Weapon Master's decks are either a 2-drop into a 2-drop into a Fish Fight, or a play where you say put down a turn 1 Weaponsmith's Apprentice. On turn 3, you play the Blacksmith, and then you have a Fish Fight available from that 2 mana bank on turn 2. And so, again, much like with Condense, increasing the cost of a spell is a very big update. I think this will probably limit a lot of what we see out of the kind of Jax in anything style decks, how we kind of saw Jax Varus creep up at the end of this past season. But I think decks like Aatrox Vayne are still going to be happy to play it, and I think Jax is still going to include it as well. But most definitely a nerf to Fish Fight. I just don't think it's enough to make it go away. It's so incredibly versatile. Up next, Lord Broadmane, down from 5 health to 4 is what it is. He's still quite strong. I haven't ran into too many spaces to where I just said, curses, Lord Broadmane has too much health, and so it most certainly weakens him, but not as much as a mana increase. Vaults of Helya from 4 mana to 5, that's fine. That deck is super annoying, and having one of the core components increase when it's not a spell is incredibly painful for that style of deck. And so I think the Nasus deck, if you're really looking to pop off with like the very fast Nasuses, you're going to be much more reliant on your 1/3 Rockbear Shepherd generating the 5/5. Now that your 5 space is taken up with the landmark. And so it should key it down a turn, which I think is probably pretty good and pretty healthy. I don't think that deck is overpoweredly strong. I think it's just super frustrating to play against. Up next, Squeaker. After years and years and years of buffs, Squeaker finally nerfed down to 1 attack from 2. And I think he's still exceptionally good. Going through the past month playing a bunch of Jinx Cannon, I've been more and more and more impressed with Squeaker over time. The bummer with him is you really need to kind of play that extra Yordle before he gets to attack. And so we'll see how much that comes down. It's just like there's so many 3/2 style units that run around that Squeaker would now not be able to combat with. But I think all of the Returno Wrench decks are still going to be at their core playing Squeaker as the main build around component that isn't a champion. Up next, we have Returno Wrench. I'm not convinced that this is a nerf. I think this might actually be a exceptionally strong buff to the Returno Wrench. The +1 health can be quite powerful, and so you trade out dealing a point of damage to making your units more resilient, and if your units aren't dying, then that really helps fuel them into just dealing more damage than that impact would have actually done. And so as we look at a unit like Squeaker, if we have this kind of standard curve as to where we play a random 2-1 on the first turn of the game, turn 2 we play Squeaker, discard Returno Wrench, he now survives against just an absolute monstrous number of units within the format, just every 2-3 he can now survive into. Now, while he doesn't want to be attacking on turn 2 into that 2-3, in the past, he was never attacking, and now he can attack in the future into those units and survive. And so I think that this is legitimately going to be a buff to Returno Wrench. I was excited to play it in the past, and I am doubly excited to play it now. I think this is going to be one of the big ones that we play a ton of in Eternal. Up next, Fleet Admiral Shelley lost her attune. That's probably fair. This card is just still pretty obnoxious to me, especially as we will see Nami updated in the future. And so losing out on the Fleet Admiral Shelley Nami deck, I don't feel like is a real detriment to the game. I felt like that deck was pretty obnoxious as it was good and played, and I'm not really interested in seeing it get exceptionally strong again. Okay, so up next, into the buffs section, the Warlord's Palace, countdown from 9 to 8. And this is the kind of thing I'm not like super sold on. Like I think that Warlord's Palace and Action were fine. The problems that we ran into with Action up to this point has been that Shurima is dog shit. And if you wanted to play Shurima, you essentially had to play Action. And, you know, I feel like Nidalee has been the first real kind of like push away from that sense, right? To where, okay, you can play the Sundisk or you can play Action, the rest of these cards are shit. Now with Nidalee running around and avenging the Staya, they've actually got some real powerful and potent cards. And the Shurima identity isn't essentially just Action. Excuse me, but the thing that really kind of like draws me in with this is the line about momentous choice. And as we're going to see here in a bit, Lee Sin got unnerfed as well, and Nami is going to be back in the game in a strong sense. And like I worry ultimately about the sense that like momentous choice will like have similar cards and it'll have things be replaced. Like the strength of Action and all of these degenerate cards isn't really based on momentous choice. It's on the idea of just chaining off a bunch of spells over and over and over again. And while momentous choice probably was a mistake, being a double spell at 1 mana that was actually good, I worry in the sense that as we start to kind of bring back and resurface some of these old cards, they're just going to have to be like re-nerfed immediately again. It's kind of like whenever we see the nerf that happened to Legionary Charge, in the sense that being able to tutor for a 5 attack unit kind of limits the design space and what you can do for champions, since you have basically 6 copies of the champion in your deck if he's the only one that Legionary Charge will actually search up. And I worry that, you know, you're not getting rid of this sense of chaining together a bunch of cheap spells. It's just momentous choice was the one that was exceptionally good. And so as we kind of scroll through here and we see Warlord's Palace get buffed and Nami get changed and Lee Sin get buffed, like I worry that ultimately that cheap aspect hasn't been removed from the game, and these cards that were obnoxious before are just going to be obnoxious again. And so do I think that like Action was way too strong in the course of the game? No. Like I think Action is Warlord's Palace's side. I think he's worse now than he was in the past. You have just a multitude of new tools to remove a card like Action, high notes around, the Calling Strike moved into Shadow Isles. Like you have a lot of different ways to take him off the board. But it's just this kind of like growing theme of, hey, let's get this chain a whole bunch of spells thing back into the game that really worries me about some of these cards for the future sense. And so Warlord's Palace, again, I'm not like hating on this getting the countdown changed. I think that he was fine at 8. You just had to do something to where Shurima as a faction wasn't just Action. But I ultimately worry about some of these things we're going to see in the upcoming changes. So up next, Poro King. As he levels up, he gets to put the fresh snacks into his hand. That's fine. I think Poro King is a card that's fine to be abundantly strong and standard. I feel like if we're in a standard format to where the Poro King is good, it's probably a healthy format. And getting this little bit of extra push into the Poro King's strength, I think, is completely fine. I'm sure all the Path of Champions players out there will be quite excited about this as well. Into the next one of the Poro snacks got changed, fine, whatever. Into the Blimp Pack Poacher, he gets a third point of health. Again, I've maybe played this card one time. I haven't been particularly impressed with it. To me, for a card like Blimp Pack Poacher to be good, it has to be more like Magic with Morph, to where you can have 2 and 3 and 4 Morph units on the board. It's just too awkward in the sense to where you get the Poacher on board, he doesn't find a good combat, and then you can't really get your other ambushes going. And I feel like that's kind of the big limiting factor to this guy, is like you typically don't want to just be dropping your Nidalee straight down on the board because you have this dumb Poacher just hanging out. And so I don't feel like his problem has been his stat line as much as it is the awkwardness to get his ability out there and running. Up next is the Bristle Hog. He gets an additional point of attack. Being a 3/3 for 1 mana after a transform is a pretty good deal. I don't know if that's enough to get the Bristle Hog up and running into the standard format. As time has shown us, doing stuff like playing a 3/3 for 1 mana into a vulnerable generating card on turn 2 just isn't really good enough, right? So in the past, you could play Chip, and then you could play a Ruin Runner or a Rock Hopper, whatever that guy's called, and it just wasn't ever strong enough. It was a fine combo, but it wasn't enough to build around, and I think Bristlehog's probably in the same space. It suffers from this the spot that while being stat effective, it doesn't really add anything to the themes of your deck, and so if you're trying to play ambush cards and build them into Nidalee or build them into Curious Changeling and the like of that, Bristlehog doesn't really assist with that. And so the stat line has to be worthwhile to drain your synergies, and I'm not sure if he's quite there. Being a 3/3 for 1 is a pretty good deal, I'll give him that, but I don't think it's quite there. I also has to see the transform now, right? Makes him a little bit worse in the sense the first time an ally transforms, that's way different than once an ally is transformed this game. So having to see it's even worse. I'm not sold on you, Bristlehog. But up next, one I am sold on the strength of is Riven. And so this is just a straight buff to her, right? It says it's a small quality of life buff to Riven to make her more satisfying and synergistic with effects like equipment. But now it's each round, the first time you increase my power, grant me that much power. And so that's permanent now, right? And so in the past, it was each round, the first time you increase my power, increase that twice. And so if you played, say, a weapon hilt onto Riven, instead of giving her +2/+2, it gave her +4+, or I'm sorry, instead of 2/0, it gave her 4/0. Now it gives her the 2/0 from the equipment, but then gives her a permanent +2 attack, right? That's what Grant does. And so that strikes me as being much more than a quality of life buff. And so I was very interested in playing Riven in this upcoming format with the ideas of using things like Papercraft Dragon and using things like Returno Wrenches and Rumbles, and having her just kind of get this nice buff out of nowhere is pretty interesting. And so we're definitely going to have to give Riven another look as the new set comes out, or the variety patch comes out, we should say. So up next, we have Nami, and so you have to decide whether or not this is actually a buff to her level up condition, right? So in the past, you just had to gain a bunch of spell mana, then you could just slap Nami on the board, she would already be flipped, and then if you did that slapping on, say, turn 6, then you could have like 6 mana built up to start chaining off a bunch of spells. Now, Nami needs to see you play 6 spells, and so, well, that's not entirely true. It's not seen. You have to play 6 spells with an allied Nami in play. So you can put Nami on the board, play 3 spells, your opponent kills her. You can put second Nami on the board, play another 3 spells, and she'll flip. And so at that cost, she now gives bonus health on her level 2 flip. That was the real obnoxious point to her in the past. You had your like 3 elusives on the board. You would give each of them +6/+3. You could no longer kill those units with like a mystic shot. And so having that tied to only plus attack really weakened up Nami. Now she gives those stat bonuses again. And I'm not certain how I feel about this. Nami was just like a pretty must-kill unit in the past, but the decks that were capable of doing it just kind of either killed Nami immediately, and then the decks that weren't capable of doing it just tried to ignore her. She was basically just kind of a landmark, and so I don't think too much in that sense will change. Like, she is most certainly much more challenging to flip now. Like, if your spells cost an average of 1 mana, playing Nami and then playing another 6 mana after the fact can be pretty challenging to do, but I ultimately worry about the strength of her level 2 ability, because she was never a very interactive champion, right? And so having these boards with just a bunch of gigantic elusives on it, I'm not entirely sold on the health of that. And so we'll see. I was never a big Nami player, but I worry seeing this kind of thing come about. All right, up next, a buff I can get behind, Sun Guardian going back up to 3 health. This is what single-handedly took the Leona decks out of the game. It's just the Sun Guardian became such an important fixture within that deck. Playing the Sun Guardian on turn 3 and having it become a 3/3 and dying to your opponent's like 1 or 2 mana card was just obnoxiously bad. And so now with the Sun Guardian back in its kind of classical spot of coming down and then being a 3/4 as soon as it hits the board, ready to combat with anything, should get it in a pretty healthy space. I'm quite interested in the likes of the Sun Guardian and co coming back, in the sense that one of the kind of like major players in the previous format were things like Ornn, and having a ton of stuns baked into your deck is a fantastic way to kind of come in and combat Ornn. And so I'm curious to see if the Daybreaks can't come in and help stymie a little bit of that Weapon Master package, since the Weapon Masters didn't really catch a ton of nerfs in this set. I mean, the fish fight caught a nerf, but outside of that, we didn't see a ton. And so welcome back, Leona. I'm excited to play the 5 Daybreaks to get you to flip. We'll certainly be playing some Leona in the upcoming days. Up next, Dragon Guard Lookout gets 2 bonus attack. I mean, I guess that's okay, right? Just Demacia hasn't been hurting for rallies. You have your pick of the litter as far as rallies are concerned. Even worse with Demacia is you typically want to be playing those off of spell mana, right? If you want to think of how a game is going to sequence with dragons, you typically don't play any units the first 2 turns of the game. You bank up that 3 mana, and then you play like a 3/4 for 3, then you play a Shyvana, then you play a Challenger Dragon, then you play another 5-cost dragon. Now that on that turn 6 you played your 5-cost dragon, you can still play Relentless Pursuit. And so you really miss out on like a lot of the sequencing that Dragons wants to do by including Dragon Guard Lookout, since the problem that you have is typically spending spell mana. And so I don't think that this guy's stat line, or I should say this gal's stat line, is what's really keeping her out of play. I think it's the fact that she's a unit. And so I don't think that this is really going to be any effect whatsoever in the Dragons decks. Last but not least, Thread the Needle now costs 2 mana. I don't think anyone has ever played a physical copy of Thread the Needle in their deck. It's only become about as a Gwen flip card. And so certainly a bonus to Gwen, but I don't think that this is going to be enough to really get Thread the Needle into Standard or into Eternal. This was just not what was really limiting the card. And so we'll see. It's like, to me, it's got a lot of competition with Hate Spike, right? Like, how do you do better than Hate Spike as you're killing off your own allies? Dealing 3 damage is a pretty good deal, but also getting a Husk out of the mix is extra good. And Thread the Needle, much more relevant at 2 mana, but making the comparison to Hate Spike, it's much more challenging to get there. So buff to Gwen, not so much to the remainder of the Shadow Isles. Into this next spot, Strafing Strike now heals 5, whatever. I've never wanted to cast Strafing Strike. I don't think this changes anything. You can move on to the next one, which is a buff to Confront. And this should actually be enough to make Confront playable. playing it on a dragon and getting to draw a card is quite good. This is, to me, a pretty spectacular buff to Shyvana, and it gets you in the space to where you may actually just want to physically play the card Confront in your deck. Again, as we talked about the rally factor with the Dragon Guard Rally, or whatever that guy's called, the Dragon's decks really hurt in terms of being able to spend all of their mana and getting those spells on the board. And so, again, like you have such a glut of mid-rangey units, the space to where your deck really struggles is turn 4 you play Shyvana. Now it's turn 5, you want to spend all 5 mana on a unit, but you can say only play another 4-cost dragon. Okay, now you get into turn 6, you want to spend all 6 mana on units, but you can only play a 4-drop or a 5-drop. And so you bank up those like little bits of mana to where you have so many turns that you can't just play 2 units in the same turn, that getting to spend them through a cycle card that gives a bit of interactivity is actually quite interesting and strong. And so I don't think that this is going to be, a big 3 of inside of any Dragon's deck, but it's most certainly a buff to Shyvana, and it's a card that you can start to consider playing 1 or 2 copies of because that cycle just fixes so many problems within the deck. Up next, Dawning Shadow used to cost 7, now it costs 6. Another interesting spot to me. Always gets the bonus off of Reggie, but it's in that spot to where do you ever want to play this over Vengeance, right? And in the past, not really. Being a slow spell is such a humongous deal that you never play this over Vengeance, but like what as your secondary spell, right? Would you rather play this over Piercing Darkness? That's where you start to get in the maybe space, right? To where you get the permanent kill on the unit instead of a damage-based thing, and then you also get that minor AoE across the board. And so dropping it down to a 6-mana space, very interesting with Dawning Shadow, in that it kind of opens up the world of including this as Vengeance number 4 or Vengeance number 5 in some decks that would typically just immediately play Piercing Shadows. And so interesting update, definitely a buff. Into this next spot, I want to say it's like fetch isn't happening, right? It's just like you keep upgrading Rocket Barrage and keep trying to get it on board, and now it does 4 to an enemy and then 1 to all other enemies. And it just doesn't strike me as something that PNZ really wants to be doing. I guess you have seen the nerf to what's it called, the Caustic Rift up to 4, but I think I've seen maybe like 1 Rocket Barrage over the course of the past year, and I have got real good by Rocket Barrage, but it's kind of like, to me, half-assing it in the sense that you either want a cheap AoE spell or you want a spell that can just kill anything, right? So you want either like a Caustic Rift or you want a Thermogenic Beam. You don't really want this middle ground that does everything poorly, and so that's kind of the downside to this for me. I guess it can kill Jinx now. If like Jinx Cannon is really a thing in the space of Eternal, then maybe Rocket Barrage is excited now, but it just strikes me as trying to do too much for too much mana. And so I don't think that this is going to make a real impact. Up next, Eradicate costs 5 instead of 6. I've honestly had no desire to ever play Eradicate. I don't know if this is going to be enough to push it into decks. I'm going to lean towards no. I don't know what the deal with these AoE kill everybody's kind of unit effects is, but Ruination rarely sees play, Eradication rarely sees play. I love it because I don't want to play these cards and I don't want all my units to die, but it's been really odd to me that this style of effect hasn't really caught on in Runeterra, and I'm curious how much you have to keep pushing down the cost of Eradication before it sees play. And so, it's a powerful ability. If Pirates is really strong, then I'm sure this has a space to be a thing, but I'm never going to play it, so just move on, right? Get us to another burn spell or something. Let's talk about Decimate for a while instead of Eradicate. And so all right, moving on to the next one though. Jax is a little bit different now, right? So he wants to see equipped allies have attacked with 16 plus total power. So no longer get bonuses from defending. Like if you block, you don't get the bonus. You no longer get the bonuses from Fish Fight, but he does now pick up the ability to flip in the middle of combat. And it also kind of deals with that thing to where you attack with a unit and then your opponent, say, glimpse from beyond their unit away, it prevents that combat damage from happening. And so the patch note says it's a quality of life adjustment that shouldn't affect his power level. The big interesting thing with this is depending on how you line up your units, Jax can flip in the middle of combat, and I'm not certain if he still gets the attack bonus that way. That's an attack ability, so he shouldn't. But it says being able to get Jax's level 2 stat buff on attack when you level him makes him more satisfying. So I guess he does. It doesn't make sense to me that it should work like that since it's an attack ability, but I guess if he flips, his attack ability isn't red until it moves across the board. And so maybe that does make a little bit of sense. But now being able to get that kind of faster 6/5 attacker overwhelm me in the middle of combat should hopefully make up for these things. To me, like, Jax is one of these cards to where he is a 2-drop, and there are a lot of times to where he's obnoxious on turn 2, right? If you play Weapons Master's Apprentice on 1, Jax on turn 2, that's exceptionally strong. But for the most part, to me, Jax was like a 6-drop that costs 2 mana. And what I mean by that is he's not that great on turn 2. He kind of dies to everything, and you're really wanting to flip so you can get that overwhelm ability onto your Ornn from the Light of Acacia. And it was a card that you played on turn 2 if you had to, but you more than likely waited until later in the game when you could get Jax down and your opponent's already spent a little bit of removal and you have like a Troll Chant in hand or something at that point, and he can be a little bit protected. That's what I mean when I say he's a 6-drop that costs 2 mana, is you typically just don't play him on turn 2 unless you specifically have Weaponsmith's Apprentice or you have no other curve filler. And so I think this does, kind of interestingly make him a bit stronger in the sense that when he does come down on turn 6, you aren't waiting until like turn 8 to try and get that big boosted Weapon Master based attack. And so I'll be interested. I of course love Jax Ornn, and so I want to see how that goes. So up next, Realm's Caretaker gets the switch from Yordle to Fae. I don't entirely know what I feel about this. I guess they're moving all of the traps and boon stuff into fairies, which makes sense with the 2-cost 2/2 fairy, the junk construct. Just make them all fairies. I guess that's where we're going. I'm curious how that kind of reflects within the package, though, as you have cards like Glimmer Lantern, whatever that thing's called, that makes all the fairies cheaper. And then from Yordles, you have like the attacky Yordles like Paparo. And so kind of picking and choosing where these things get placed is kind of interesting. Just changing your type out of nowhere from Yordle to fairy. Interesting to me, but I don't think Realm's Caretaker is one to where that's going to have a direct effect. Portal Scholar, a little bit differently. I could definitely see portal-based fairy build-arounds because this is actually a good card, and having the Junk Construct and Portal Scholar both add portals and be fairies gets you into a spot to where it could be kind of an interesting fairy build-around, and so we'll see how that plays out. I don't think these are super relevant, though. So, one of the changes that does really concern me, Lee Sin going from 10 spells back to 8. This is one of those things that ties into Momentous Choice being merged into a single spell, but this is again one of these cards that as time goes on, there's going to be more and more ways to grant overwhelms to units. There's going to be more and more cheap spells that are just relevant over the course of the game, and I ultimately worry that the single change to Momentous Choice isn't reason enough to unnerf Lee Sin. I feel like the kind of combo control nature that the Lee Sin decks brings is pretty fucking obnoxious, and I'm not really excited to see that unleashed back on the world, especially as it's like, oh, cool, it's a nerf action at the same time. And so it's like not only does his counterpart get nerfed, we start to see better and better Shurima cards turn up as well. And so, I worry about this one. I've never been a real big fan of the Lee Sin play pattern. If you're not familiar with what Lee Sin does, on his flip, he does the Dragon Kick thing to where he knocks a unit out of combat and the opponent takes damage equal to his attack. And then if Lee Sin has Overwhelm, since there's no blocker, he just deals damage directly to the opponent. And so if you have a flipped Lee Sin, he has 4 attack. If you cast Might on him, he has 7. Then you just directly deal 14 damage to the opponent. If you want to play an Elixir of Iron into the mix, then you now have him up to 10 attack, and he just deals 20 to the opponent in one big shot. And so I don't know, maybe Ionia just needs a little bit of help, but it just strikes me as being, if action is the face of Shurima because all the Shurima cards are shit, then maybe Lee Sin doesn't need to be the face of Ionia because all the Ionia cards are shit. Just maybe don't print as many shitty Ionia cards. It's not as much of a problem. That's the way to fix it, right? You just make the bad cards good and then print more bad cards than the other sets, and the Ionia cards look much better by comparison. But I'm really not excited to see the change to Lee Sin. Up next, Withering Mists now from 5 mana to 4. This is potentially getting it in that spot of goodness. This is a big potent answer to a lot of the aggro decks. Killing 2 units and gaining 4 health almost certainly ends the game on its own. And having this drop down in cost can definitely bring the Shadow Isles back into the fixture. And so this is one that strikes me as being more relevant in terms of getting cheapened than the likes of Eradicate was. And so very powerful upgrade to the Shadow Isles there. Up next, the Fangs being a 3-2 now. Okay, people will play this card. It's terrible. You can move on to the next one. Egnivia now has 2 health. Don't care. Thorny Toad now a 3-1 instead of a 1-4. This is an interesting update to me. Like I skipped over the part to where they said they're making a bunch of these changes to be more relevant in Path of Champions. It turns out Thorny Toad is actually quite relevant and constructed in Sea Monsters, but this is a weird nerf to Sea Monsters in the sense that it used to be able to block all of the good aggro units. It could block a Legion Rearguard twice and just prevent infinite damage, and now it's unable to do that kind of thing, being a 3-1. And so very weird change to the Thorny Toad, but I like it because I don't like playing against Sea Monsters. So Yone, down from 7 mana to 6, not enough to make him constructed viable, so that would just be a Path of Champions change. Windfare Hatchling gets its original stat line back at 5-4. This is the kind of classic elusives buff game finisher style unit. I don't feel like this is enough to make it see play in Eternal, but as decks like Ari Kennen get the chance to shine, maybe they'll prefer to play the Hatchling over something like Saiyan Thousand-Tailed, and so maybe this is there. Continuing on with more Ionia buffs, I'm actually kind of interested in Scattered Pod. I mean, a 5-5 for 5 mana that draws one of your spells is pretty good. Just cheapening it up by a singular point can get this into relevance. I mean, I guess the place where this struggles is like, do you ever want to play Scattered Pod over Set? No. And do you want to play 6 5-drops in a deck that has Set in it and has Karma in it? Probably not. And so I don't think this is going to push this into constructed relevance, but it's getting close. And then Mountain Scryer still garbage. Ancient Crocolith, the biggest buff to concurrent timelines. Ancient Crocolith now getting fearsome, so you can play concurrent timelines on turn 2. You can play for the Combat Cook on turn 4, get the forged equipment, and then flip him into a now fearsome Ancient Crocolith. Can't wait to pull that one off. And then the Swiftwing Lancer gets a point of health. Not constructed relevant, but that's okay. Great Horn Companion also gets an extra point of health. Almost constructed relevant, but probably not quite enough. Cavalier and Academy Prodigy also getting bonus health. Don't think these are going to be constructed relevant, but as we see the potential for a draft format coming up in the next year or so, and the Path of Champions players being forced to play with some of this stuff, those will most certainly have some relevant updates there. What else we got? Fuzzy Caretaker. Surprise Loping Telescope caught an upgrade, but it did. Yordle Newbie, Arbiter of the Peak saw a touch of play. I forget who it was. When people kind of figured out the Plaza Guardian deck, the next thing was like, well, maybe we'll do the same thing with Arbiter of the Peak. He is a much better unit, having Overwhelm and being able to still come down very cheap. He could fit in there. And so he's one to actually kind of keep a watch on. Giddy Sparkleologist is interesting as well, now actually having a good stat line. But for the most part, I don't think these are going to make too much difference. I know I'm skipping over these. Wish is never relevant. Star Tipped Peak could be relevant at 1 mana. 1 mana, draw 2 cards isn't terrible, so that could be a thing. Rhinefang Wolf sees some fringe play. Being a 3-3 doesn't change too much with it, but most certainly better. One that I'm actually interested in is Avarosian Outriders. The Freylord Overwhelms deck is, almost enough just on its own. It doesn't really need to be playing other factions to be good. And so Averosian Outriders does have a bit of a shot, and a 4/4 Overwhelm for 4 isn't a terrible deal. And so this is one of these that we're just cycling through that could see a bit of a play and a touch of an up as his upgrade comes in. Weirding Stones, don't care. Molten Breath, I don't think this is ever relevant. I mean, this is an upgrade to a degree, and that if you're playing, say, like Jace Lux, this card is taken out of Reggie's card pool now, but as far as constructed relevance, not so much. Stalking Broodmother, do not expect this one to be constructed relevant either. Abyssal Guard picks up a tune, slightly closer to being relevant. I'm always curious about the potential strength of a card like Abyssal Guard, in that if you chain off like 3 spells and make this an 8 attack unit, that's some interesting combo potential that it could have, but I still don't think it's going to be good enough. Insightful Investigator, never seeing play. Radiant Guardian sees a little bit of fringe play. Going up to 5 attack as its original form certainly helps out a little bit, and this really just depends on how aggressive the formats are. If you want this 5/5 lifesteal tough unit, you can fit it in, and so this is potentially relevant depending on the meta. And then one of the more interesting ones, Rite of Renewal, now at burst. I don't think people will be rushing out to get Rite of Renewals in their deck, but it does get generated by the Ionian Tellstones, which makes it relevant in the sense that your opponent can now burst heal 4 mana in the middle of combat. Much more expensive than a health potion, but if you're playing the Tellstones, that's something to potentially watch out for. All right, we are almost to the end. So many changes in this patch. I haven't kept watch of the time, but I bet this is going to be like a fucking 4-hour video. But we do come into Vladimir. He is the last one in the mix, and he did get a bit of a rework. And so on the level 1, he no longer does the damage your dudes to the right thing. He now comes into play, deals damage to any of your units, and then deals that much damage to an opposing unit. So if you deal 4 damage to your units, you can then deal 4 damage to an opposing unit, which is a very powerful angle to be coming at with him. The question is, how realistically and how reliably can you have units on the board to have these effects, and how much damage do you need to deal for this to be relevant? And so in a lot of spaces, just dealing 1 point of damage is enough to really be interesting, right? Depending on how much value you're getting out of that damage. So if you're putting a point of damage onto Braum and getting a Poro and killing off an opposing unit, that's not a terrible deal, but that's pretty fringe playable in terms of what we're getting out of a champion. What he really needs to be doing is like 3 damage. And how likely are we to be able to realistically and reasonably be dealing 3 damage? That's kind of up in the air, you know? You can really kind of design and craft your decks to ensure that you have a lot of cheap stuff in your deck to slam down on the board for Vladimir, but is that what we're really going to be seeing in terms of Vladimir build-arounds, right? That's typically in the space of looking to use the Scar Grounds and the self-damage kind of stuff, to where you have like Scarthane Stephans and Scarmother Virnas and Braum, and these units are all like very expensive. And so I'm not entirely certain from just kind of deck building perspective that those units are actually any good with Vladimir anymore. It feels like you need to be in a much more aggressive kind of space, to where you're getting like Legion Rearguards on the board, and you're getting Crimson Pigeons on the board, things that can like naturally survive the single point of damage, but also be relevant in an aggressive sense. And so if you are able to deal like 3 damage with Vladimir and kill a 3-cost unit, that's just such a massive tempo play that I think he has, you know, the real possibilities for strength. It's just, I think, going to take a bit of reimagining in what we want a Vladimir deck to look like, since those kind of drain, self-damage, Scar Grounds-y kind of things, I don't think are really going to be cutting it anymore. And so I'm curious to where that points to and where that goes. But I think that idea and concept makes sense, though, right? If you play a Scarthane Stefan on turn 3, you play a Braum on turn 4, you're only getting to deal 2 points of damage, right? And if you do even worse, if you play the Scar Grounds on turn 3 and play Braum on turn 4, you only get to deal 1 point of damage. And so, you know, I think it just takes kind of a re-envisioning of what you expect a Vladimir deck to look like. and then you should be able to pick up on something kind of interesting that he's capable of doing. And so I'll be interested. He immediately strikes me as being interested in playing with Swain. Swain working his level up magic in the same way that Vladimir does things. Also having cards like the Tentacle Maker, whatever it's called, the Tentacle Statue, leveling up both Swain and Vladimir is kind of interesting. Like, there's a lot of interesting angles that you can take in that space, but it's going to take, to me, a little bit of a deeper dive in kind of determining what will work with Vladimir. But I think he's got a pretty powerful kit, right? Coming down, making a tempo-based play is quite strong. His fearsome regenerate stat line is quite good. Getting that drain style of ability at level 2 is pretty good as well. And so I think there's definitely something here with Vladimir now. It's just going to take a little bit of a reimagining what the old Vladimir decks have looked like compared to the new ones. So, that's it. Man, we've made it through all the cards. There's a little bit more to scroll through here. The competitive thing is just saying we're playing Eternal this month. That's wonderful. They've added in the Emporium now, which is a re-envisioning of the store. I'm curious to see what this comes about with in terms of being able to acquire old skins and the like. It's tough for me to really get a kind of gauge on how people really feel about spending money in this game, right? There's the group of people that are like, well, I'm not spending any money on any game ever, so I'm just going to free to play it. You see a large contingent of people on Reddit that are like, I will spend tons of money if you just give me the opportunity to spend it. And then there's a lot of people that are like, well, I want to go back in time and give you money for some of these skins and things that I missed. And I'm sure that Riot has done a ton of work in this sense and a ton of research as far as figuring out whether or not it's a better deal to make the classic skins for sale or to whether or not they should be FOMO blocked behind an event pass, right? So if you want the Aurelian Soul skin, you have to get the event pass. You have to do a bunch of grinding to unlock it. And then if you miss out, you miss out. You can't get it ever again. I'm sure the market research analysts could tell you a distinct dollar value that gets applied per person for that kind of thing. Whatever, I don't really care. The thing that matters to me and is interest of me is it has the green shards listed in here. And one of the things that's like always been interested to me is like we have over 1 million green shards now. We don't use them for literally anything. And I was curious if Riot would ever kind of like attack the inflation of green shards in the sense that if we want to craft cards at some point, do we ever have to buy wild cards? Like, is there ever a push to move this a little bit further away from a free-to-play game and pushing newer players or more casual players into this space to where they have to spend money to unlock some of the cards? Like, I don't know. Again, that's something for the Riot market research team to go in and figure out. But I think it's interesting to at least have like an inflationary value sink for things like green shards. I think it would also be wonderful if you look at Hearthstone. At least back when I played Hearthstone, they had the heroic brawls, which would be like the ruthless rumbles that we have in this game, but you could spend like an absurd amount of in-game currency to jump into these events, or you could buy in with real money. And I'm curious if we won't ever see a space to where like Riot tries to attack the green shard inflation and put in events like that, or if they'll just approach it in this kind of space as to where like it's very easy in this space to be like, you want to spend your shards, 100k for this skin or 250k for this skin. Like that attacks the inflationary aspect of all those shards really fast. And so I'm curious how this stuff will kind of play out. And so, if you're hoping to pick up some of these old things, great. The options are there apparently. Hopefully, my concern is like, if you look at the stores on like Marvel Snap, they're fucking predatory, right? To me, there's a degree of catering to whales, which, if you want to buy this $50 skin, it's not going to have any effect on the game, so be it. But if you want to, unlock some of these new cards, then having to spend money on it, it feels very predatory in terms of the ways that Marvel Snap approaches things, to where even less free-to-play friendly games like Hearthstone aren't nearly as bad. And so, there's a good mix of everything, I'm certain. But this is the one that I really honed in on and focused in on, was the green shards, because I'm curious if we're ever going to be able to spend our million. Last but not least in here, there are some big Path of Champions updates. I don't pay attention to Path of Champions anymore. If you use the FTP bus site for Path of Champions stuff, I got rid of it for this exact reason. I was not going to make Path of Champions content anymore, and as soon as something changed, like you see this, I don't know, 50 lines of changes that are happening in Path of Champions, then the site was going to be out of date, and I had no intention and desire to update it. And so if you use the site as a Path of Champions resource, I'm sorry I took that away. Hopefully somebody out there is still maintaining all of Path of Champions stuff somewhere. I'm just not doing it, and so is what it is. But all right, time to get out of this one. I've been talking for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Feels like we've been here all fucking day. My voice is starting to go, so we gotta go. So, as with all the patch notes, agree, disagree with anything we said? Love to hear it. Be glad to know how you feel about how wrong we are about all of these cards. And excited to jump into the new gameplay starting tomorrow. And so that is going to do it for us today. So hope everyone enjoyed the video. Hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way and had a good time watching. So this is Busted Me. Thank you for being here.